Hi, hello, welcome back or welcome in if you're new. On this channel, I simply post videos where I share my writing journey with whomever might be interested in following it. As such, you will find videos about making your own book covers, guides about the online writing platforms that I use, as well as writing vlogs and plotting, etc., etc., etc. In the previous video, I've talked about my new fantasy romance web novel, which is currently being released on the platform webnovel. I said I'd be making a video discussing my entire planning and plotting process, exactly like I did with or for my first web novel. So here I am today, delivering on that promise. I'd like to start with the inspiration. I can't speak of only one thing that inspired me for this story, because as I said in the video about how and where I get my inspiration, I gather many ideas I get from different sources and sometimes merge them together and see if I can come up with something cohesive. All I knew was that I wanted to write a fantasy romance story between a human and a vampire. Anyways, for that, I resorted to my go-to app for the first step, Whimsical, where I like to throw darts at the wall and see what sticks. Here is the board I made for this story. Yes, most of it is blurred because it contains all of the information for my novel, information that may or may not already have been released in the published chapters. So, these white blocks here that are linked together are the pillars of the story, encompassing crucial information about the universe itself, as well as the two main characters around whom everything is built. The deep purple block contains loose ideas that I may or may not want to implement in the story going forward, and the sheer purple blocks contain fun facts or simply facts and information about the universe that appear in chapters. They're important to note so that they can be much easier to find, whether it be when I'm polishing the plan or especially as I'm still working on the first draft. Going back to the inspiration talk, the story starts in the year of 1679. That has nothing to do with that same year in our real world, since it's a fictional universe crafted from the ground up based on the realities of the world we live in, mingled with the many definitions and perspectives we have of magic, mythological creatures, and all of that. It is a fantasy romance after all, not historical or contemporary. The vibe, fashion, and architecture are a mix of medieval and gothic, varying from one faction to another as well as from one town to another. Basically, I worked with an interval starting from the 5th century and going up to somewhere between the 15th and the 17th century. This large span would demonstrate the difference in culture between different species and help build or track the history of each. If I take the auxiliary chapter from my book titled History, it contains important information directly derived from this first block here to sort of give a little idea of what to expect. The truth is, I pinned a year down for the start of the story so that the math down the line would be easier, meaning calculating and setting up historical or important dates wouldn't be much of a hassle because time and dates are brought up throughout the chapters, and by having a set time, the timeline is much clearer and easier to imagine. But this is something I'll talk about when I get to the timeline and world building section. I've picked a name for the kingdom that is, of course, tied to a prominent aspect of the kingdom. In this case, it would be the weather. Solis Aivum would roughly translate to the land of the sun. The land where it rains on some days but rarely ever snows. It's a place stuck in perpetual springtime, basically. The inspiration for this came from watching our own garden at home on a sunny day. It brought me such joy to see the vibrant colors in front of me that I wished it didn't always look like that. And we have the 120 years war between humans and other creatures. Yes, we live in a world where wars can last centuries for various reasons. The common denominator, of course, is always human nature. The war in this universe was between humans and the rest of the intelligent creatures that shared the kingdom with them. Again, reminiscent of the real world where wars are waged because of differences in race or religion and, well, anyways. Now, this war here culminated in a splitting of the land 50-50 between humans and, as they're called in this universe, the creatures of the night. This part here is heavily inspired by the events that took place on the 9th of November 1989, or the fall of the Wall of Berlin, which marked history. However, in this story, I talk not about the fall of a wall, but the total opposite, the splintering of the population into two halves. This again will be talked about in the history and timeline section. Now, besides the universe around, when I first started brainstorming for the story, I didn't start with the history or timeline. I started with the two main characters and how I wanted them to be. The truth is, I wanted them to be, well, not the total opposite of the two main characters from my other romance story, but I wanted a stark contrast in their personalities. I just wanted to work with something different. Let me explain. For example, in my other story, the main female character, Rosemary, is quite independent since she's lived, I wouldn't say completely on her own, but still, she had a complicated relationship with both of her parents, both for drastically different reasons, and she essentially moved out at the age of 14. She was taught to take care of herself and face life. That has affected her personality, of course. She became pretty pragmatic, resourceful, witty, sarcastic, quite blunt, and confident in her own skills, sometimes to a fault, and that is where her most prominent flaws come from. Arabella, on the other hand, despite her terrible relationship with her father, she was very close to her mother, until she lost her in her early 20s, that is. But the fact remains, she had a great female role model. Now, she is a smart young woman, but not very confident in her own capacities due to the fact that she was sheltered and her entire life being planned and dictated to her by her father. Now, this part here comes from the fact that history has not been kind to women, and like I said, the vibes I am going for are stuck between the 5th and 17th century. Even in a universe where magic is a thing, the dynamic between human men and women are reminiscent of that era of history. In any case, growing up in that atmosphere, she's become very sweet and kind like her mother, not very resourceful or resilient at first, quite naive and very shy. Although the first thing that the readers will see her do in the first chapter is go against the will of her father. But that would be the very first time ever she'd take a stand and make a choice of her own. But you get the picture. Rosemary and Arabella aren't necessarily opposites, but they're very different from each other nonetheless. More talk about the characters in the characters section. However, one can't say that the inspiration for them came from characters that are already created. They're crafted around the fact that I wanted to work with a new set of characters, not just a repeat of the same couple in a different universe. That is why these two sets of blocks are entirely about the main characters, like their ages, backstories, personalities, and skills. Like I said before, the white blocks are pillars of the story, basically what I have to work around or with in order to build the rest of it. So, for detailed planning, I moved from whimsical to Notion. And that is where I expanded on these blocks here and developed them, but also incorporated the rest of the ideas and sort of fused them into full-fledged elements of the story. What I really love about planning in Notion is that you can tuck everything under a toggle title like this, rendering things very simple and easy to navigate. My first long story was done in Google Docs, and I've kept it there because my brain already got used to it the way it is there. I didn't want to change a thing. Anyways, the first section is the general info section where I put the basics about the story, such as the genre, the subgenre, tags, synopsis, and all of that. Now, about the world building, I'm sure that at least someone will think or say that this is just a romance novel. Why bother with the details or focus on such things so early on into the writing process? But first, this is something I feel the need to do because I know myself. Only I live in my own head. I know what's going on in it, and I know that I forget a lot and get lost a lot. I need to set up my own map in order to find my way through it when I'm writing. However, besides that, and going back to the fact that it is a romance story, while it is true that the goal is to see the two main characters get together in the end and build a relationship along the way, in my opinion, focusing solely on the characters won't do, because they're not cast into the void. They're both surrounded by certain atmospheres, and that influences their lives. They were raised in specific environments and cultures, and that, of course, will have an impact on their personalities, as well as shape almost every aspect of them. They are part of the world they live in. It reflects in them in many ways, and thus, building a world that is hopefully coherent enough will help readers feel like your characters are actually alive wherever they are. Like the first ever long conversation between them, they sort of bond a little over their interest in the history of their land and how it came to be the way it is in their day. Now, with all of that being said, I did keep it pretty simple. Right after that comes the characters list, and the cool thing about Notion is that it allows me to combine the characters lists and their charts, unlike Google Docs where I had to create two separate sections and then link them together. So first here we have the names and then the relevancy of the character. That's just how I like to categorize and split them for clarity. As for their charts, the names here followed by a page icon that we can click on and open them. These are the charts. As for those who don't have an icon, don't have a chart just yet. I've started with the most relevant ones and those that appear often in the first act. As you can see, I've organized my character's chart the same way I did for the previous story. The first thing ever I write when I create a character's chart is their backstory, always. Why? From their backstory, it becomes very easy to extrapolate their characteristics, personalities, their struggles down the line, the arcs they sort of need to go through, what they lack and therefore need to learn. It's just a great way to make a cohesive and consistent character. That is something that needs to be done for me, since I do lose my way along the writing process a lot. I do want to make a separate video about my character writing and how I go about them. After that, this section titled The World. And it has everything that concerns this universe that I've created. First and foremost, this world is an Earth-like planet that revolves around one star, or the sun, and also has one moon. It has an axial tilt and an orbit that directly influence the four seasons. This planet spins in a way that renders every place almost static in terms of weather, meaning one place, for example, would be stuck in eternal freezing winter, whereas another would be stuck in spring or summer or autumn as we know them, leaving one stretch of land almost always condemned to perpetual night, even longer than the polar nights we know. How would that be possible? Well, instead of having an orbit that resembles this, it would have this. And instead of an axial tilt that would lean close to 23 degrees, it would instead lean to 90 degrees. The orbit also influences the number of days in a year, so instead of completing one rotation around the sun in 12 months, this planet does so in 8 months, and I've named the months after the 8 major pagan holidays. Each of these months is marked by a specific celebration, of which the details vary from one zone to another. These would be based on the weather, but of course they are reminiscent of the holidays they're named after. They have close tie to them. Look, I know I said I kept it simple, but even though it does seem like it, I assure you this is actually fairly minimal, because not only am I not an expert in the matter, but I also didn't do any in-depth calculations to ensure the close to perfect accuracy and coherence of how this world would function. I pinned some down and left the rest for nature to deal with. Nature can be so random sometimes and break its own rules. I have talked about the planet in general and weather, but now I think it's time to zoom down a little bit and see what it actually looks like, because after determining the most important aspects of the two leads and main events leading up to their meeting, I needed to craft this world around them. I have a map that I've scribbled on paper, but what I have settled on is the fact that the kingdom is sandwiched between a large stretch of land dubbed the Windy Land from east and 3 smaller, I wouldn't call them kingdoms, but they are distinguished by their extreme conditions of weather and nature, where only specific species can survive, thus preventing human and many of the creatures from even attempting to conquer those lands. I've had this aspect also pinned down because geography is brought up a lot throughout the story along the history, especially since the female lead is passionate about history, which was what allowed her to essentially escape the hold of her father and the sad life he condemned her to lead. There will be many instances where the main characters will talk about the history of their kingdom as well as the rest of the world. Now, right after a map of the universe I imagined, I've noted all of the intelligent species that would exist, even if they're irrelevant to the story, because I technically based the geography on them and the condition they're most likely to handle. For example, Sorlus Ivium is neither too cold nor too warm. The days there are mostly sunny, reminiscent of the spring season, and the nights are generally colder, but almost never dropping below freezing temperature. Thus, humans, regular werewolves, or wolf folks, as they're called in this universe, fairies, witches, goblins, ghouls, and vampires will be drawn to it. Now, technically, vampires are able to withstand extreme temperatures. However, their source of nutrition cannot, therefore forcing them to stay the closest possible to humans and some other sorts of animals. Same thing for ghouls. On the eastern side, the temperature is always close to a freezing one. So the windy or highland is covered in snow almost all year round. It's a place where the winds never stop, always raging quite violently. The further east, the lower the temperature with this one. Also known as the spirit realm, due to the fact that it's inhabited mostly by spirits who care not for cold nor the wind. They also don't care for hot temperatures, but they live east because they don't really get along with many other creatures, since even in a world so diverse, they are considered the outsiders for the simple reason that they're the only species where its members are not born on the ground through the traditional process of breeding and conception that we know, but through another natural phenomenon that occurs in the sky and can be admired from specific places on the ground. This phenomenon will appear in a chapter later in one of the storylines I am planning. Next to them, we have the snow wolves, who live in the far east since they cannot handle higher temperatures. Next up, the lower lands of Gehenna, northwest. Due to the presence of multiple active and constantly erupting volcanoes, the temperature would be unbearably high for a human and many other species. The name Gehenna is a direct translation of hell. It's always cloudy, red, and suffocatingly hot. Only fire demons can live in a place like that. The country directly below or south of Gehenna would be Caligo, or the Shadowland. Wind usually blows from north down to south, and that's where the breath of the volcanoes travel. The clouds that form there as a result are so thick they allow no light to penetrate day and night. The temperature is lower than in Gehenna, but the air would be unbreathable for humans and many others. The only creatures that would bear to live there would be shadow demons. They can't stand natural light at all, meaning neither the sun nor the moon. Caligo is the only place for them. And then, south of that, we have the wasteland. The temperature is even lower than in Caligo, but the clouds are thinner, allowing some light through. However, it's not enough to sustain many aspects of life, such as greenery, which means that many species would not populate the area. Not herbivores, and as such, no carnivores, meaning also no humans, and the food chain follows. Not to mention that while the air is more breathable than in Caligo, it's still not optimal for humans. The land is dry and the atmosphere is pretty gloomy. The wasteland is dubbed that way because nobody really inhabits it. Nobody dares venture there. Note that Gehenna, Caligo, as well as the wasteland stand at the same height or level, whereas Solis Aiwun stands higher and is delimited by high mountain chains outlining the kingdom from the west. Now, the relevant species in the story are, of course, humans, vampires, witches, fairies, and wolf folk. These are the ones that will directly interact and impact the direction of the story. We'll see more of this in the timeline part. But the species that live in a certain area may impact their environment. Witches, for example, draw their powers from the moon and gather around Castle Moon. Their continued practice of magic does affect the weather, as they made sure that the moon always shines on Castle Moon. Alright then. The story effectively starts it's kickstarted by the female lead who escapes from home. She's the daughter of a certain lord, and she was supposed to be escorted to the royal palace to serve the prince. In this part of the story, only humans and vampires will affect the story. We'll get a section during which other species will be introduced, but it's not until the second arc that witches come into play, when the female lead becomes the victim of a hypnosis spell. In the third arc, we'll see the proper introduction of fairies and their particularity to observe people's auras. I introduced this during a funny, playful segment, but it'll become more relevant later on. And the events sort of seem independent at first, but they are not. Everything that happens does so because of something that triggered it, and that in turn will unleash yet another ripple of events down the line. Example, Arabella is a nobleman's daughter. Thus, when she crosses the border and asks for refuge from the Eleazars, they don't take her in as a maid, but as a blood provider and as an entertainer for older vampires who are fascinated by human behavior and humans in general. That was why during a gathering or a ball that was held within 2 weeks from her arrival, she was invited. That was where a vampire lord that dealt business with her father recognized her and sent word for him. And that was how the next arc came around. Building a timeline that follows a chronological order of things like that, with the major events, has helped me plot and plan individual chapters a lot faster, ensuring I don't get lost in the sauce. I think you'll notice throughout this video that this page changes. That is because this video has been in the making for over a month now. So yeah, I've made many changes to this page, mainly additions. New points that I figured out and wrote into the story. This one is going to change a lot still, since as of now the web novel is still serializing on webnovel. I stuck to 2 short chapters a day because that is typically what the readers over there prefer. The link is in the description if you'd like to see the result of all of this planning. The first 24 chapters of it are free. Okay, I think I've yapped on for long enough. I'm just gonna stop this video here before I find something else to say. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been helpful to you, and if yes, then leave a like or a comment if you have a question or something else to say. Subscribe if you think my content interests you, and perhaps I'll see you in the next video. But until then, take care of yourselves, stay safe, and bye-bye.